you know, I haven't done that kind of study. My focus has been elsewhere. But I do think it's certainly in the city of Detroit, and probably in other, and its spin-offs in other communities where, those two chains own papers. There has certainly been a decline in those papers, in their readership, in their profitability, but that's been a nationwide trend in print media. I don't know to what extent that the newspaper strike pushed things in that direction, or whether the newspaper strike happened because things were already moving that way, and the companies were just bound and determined to squeeze every ounce of profit they could out of the newspapers, while they could still do it.
Sorry again. How do you feel the city of Detroit reacted to the strike? The readership of the paper, and also the general leadership of the city.
The general leadership, or leadership. I think it's hard to say, because when you talk about the city of Detroit, it's not all uniform. I mean, there are different constituencies all through the metropolitan area. For quite a few years prior to the strike, both papers had been focusing their promotional efforts in the suburbs, where they had more readers, and they sold more papers, and they had more readers in the suburban areas than they did in the core city itself. And hence their development of suburban bureaus, in which I worked, I worked in a couple of them. So, I mean, I think average readers, I think there was a huge fall off in readers, and folks that I talk to now casually, as sometimes without them even knowing that I'm a former newspaper employee, will, if the subject of the papers comes up, they'll say, well, they're just not what they used to be, and they're not. And I think the residents recognize that. I think when you talk about leadership, the corporate leadership, the political leadership, the newspapers, by virtue of their position in journalism, and as even much diminished in terms of circulation, major news outlets, and so folks who are in the business of shaping and appealing to public opinion had to keep paying attention to them, whether they particularly liked them or not. And of course, politicians have always had a kind of an arm's distance relationship in terms of of the media, in terms of their, they want to be close when it serves their purposes. They don't necessarily want to be close if the reporters are really doing their jobs and taking them to task. So that kind of they run hot and cold in that, but they also tend to recognize, for their purposes, the necessity of dealing with the media. So you get different, depending on who's paying attention to the newspapers for what reason. You get different perspectives and different kinds of reactions. There was no, I think in terms of the general public, there was a huge drop off in support for the papers, and I don't think they've won back a majority of what they lost by any means. And I think the circulation numbers demonstrate that. Although there are a lot of people out there up since then or weren't paying attention at the time and don't really understand that part of the history of those newspapers, and so just see them as what they, for what they are right now, and deal with them accordingly.
Was there any violence on the picket line?
Yeah, I mean, I say that, in a sense begrudgingly, because as a historian, I know that, what passed for violence on that, in that strike was very, very, very small potatoes, compared to, a lot of labor strikes in the past. I mean, you look at the Battle of the Overpass, 1932, something like that, with the 34, with the organizing of the UAW. Nothing like that. I mean, there was some pushing and shoving. There was one night, a couple of nights out in Sterling Heights, where, there was one night I nearly got run over by a semi. Semi drove right at me. They were coming out in a convoy, we'd been kind of blocking a gate, and the goon squad, the company's paramilitary security detail came out and sort of, we backed off into the street because they had batons and shields and helmets, and we didn't. And so we backed up, but then they had the gates open. The trucks just came rolling out about 35 miles an hour. It was fast enough so that when they made the turn onto Metro Parkway, that the tops of the semis were tipping because they were making the turn so fast, and they weren't going to stop. And I think I was one of the last people to step out of the way. If I hadn't moved, I'd been run over. And consequently, a lot of people were so angry that they, started throwing things, whatever they could find, and pounding on the vehicles as they passed, and broke a few headlights and stuff like that. And when they closed up the gates after the convoy had gone, when they closed up the gates, the company intentionally parked a number of old trucks right by the, rather than chaining the gates closed, they had chained them closed. They had chained them closed at the beginning. They had came out and cut the chains, and after they came out, after the convoy had left, they closed the gates, and rather than chain them closed, they parked trucks in front of them. Trucks eventually got burned, and that was all over the news at the time. So it was portrayed as a huge violent episode, but they were old trucks. They were, I'm convinced, were intentionally put there by the company to get burned, to get trashed, so that they'd have public relations benefit of it. There was no need for them to park them out there otherwise, because they weren't parked there before. It was like, here, burn these so we can get videotape of strikers being violent. And they had just tried to kill us, in my view. Because literally, if I had not stepped out of the way, I'd been run over by that truck. I don't know about you, but getting run over by a semi, probably not going to do good things to your body.
Earlier you mentioned the Sunday Journal. I was wondering if you could describe that paper a bit.
Well, I can't recall exactly when they started. There was a lot of debate among the unions that we should have started a strike paper right away. There was delay of some months before it got off the ground. But it was a weekly newspaper. It was put out by the strikers. The unions basically financed it as an alternative. We had there was a wide range of things that were in there. Always coverage of the strike and what was going on to get the word out there. But, and I can't remember how long it lasted. It lasted a couple of years. Eventually they closed it down because it was too expensive for the unions to continue publishing. But had a lot of good work from a lot of good people in it.
Are there any continuing labor issues within the newspaper industry? I know that recently they renegotiated a contract.
That I really don't know about because you know, my life has gone in different directions since 1995. I got back into teaching. I spent 10 years teaching in the Detroit Public Schools, and for the last 4.5, almost 5 years, I've been teaching at the university level. And so, you know, I went in a very different direction. I haven't stayed close. I know that there was, you know, I seem to heard recently in the last few months about negotiations on a new contract, but I don't know. I really don't know any details. I don't know what came of it. I don't know what, you know, what all is involved.
All right, well, those are the questions I had prepared. I was wondering if you had anything else you would like to say to close this out.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was a long and tumultuous strike. I mean, a lot of very emotional for an awful lot of people. I think it did an enormous amount of damage to the city of Detroit. I think it actually did a lot of damage to the companies that ran the papers. You know, and I think part of the proof of that is that Knight Ridder doesn't exist anymore. And I think it is, you know, was emblematic of a very negative trend in American society that has been accelerated, an anti-union, anti-labor attitude in society that's been accelerating since the PATCO strike, it was 1981. And went hand in hand with 30 years of the rich getting richer and the working class getting poorer. You know, I think that, you know, if you look at it in that context, that, you know, I mean, in 1979, the top 1% of wage earners accounted for about, and not wage earners necessarily, but not a number of top 1% of incomes. Most of those folks don't earn wages. Most of them, you know, have, you know, take in dividends and other kinds of income. The top 1% of income accounted for about somewhere between 8 and 9% of the total income in the United States. 2007, that was that same 1%. Their share of the total income pie had gone up to about almost 23.5%. And so what you see in the newspaper strike is part of that process, squeezing working folks for the benefit of corporate profits and income of the wealthy. You know, that's the bottom line, as the corporate wizards would say.